So there I was, floating in my observation pod above Earth, watching these bizarre creatures called humans go about their daily routines. My name is Velox, and I'm what you might call a xenobiologist for the Galactic Council. You know, the boring job where you catalog species and pretend they're all equally fascinating. Spoiler alert, they're not. Humans had recently been classified as harmless herbivores with mild intelligence. Yeah, right. Whoever wrote that report clearly hadn't been paying attention. But hey, what did I know? I was just the guy stuck monitoring their backwater planet while everyone else got the exciting assignments. The day everything went sideways started like any other. I was sipping my morning stimulant, watching a small human settlement called Pine Ridge through my scanners. Population, roughly 3,000. Notable features, absolutely nothing. The most exciting thing that had happened there in months was when old Martha Henley's cat got stuck in a tree. But then I noticed something that made my 3 hearts skip a beat. A ship. Not a human ship, mind you. This was sleek, predatory, and definitely not supposed to be in this sector. I recognized the design immediately. Vrakari hunting vessel. And those particular nasties didn't visit planets for the tourism. Oh, fantastic, I muttered, nearly spilling my drink on the control panel. Just what this assignment needed. Space pirates. The Vrakari were known throughout the galaxy for 3 things: their complete lack of table manners, their tendency to shoot first and ask questions later, and their particularly nasty habit of collecting specimens from primitive worlds. Guess which category Earth fell into? I watched as the ship performed a textbook stealth landing in the forest outside Pine Ridge. My scanner picked up heat signatures as 6 Vrakari warriors disembarked. Each one stood roughly 8 feet tall, covered in chitinous plates that could deflect most energy weapons. Their multiple arms ended in razor-sharp claws, and their compound eyes could spot movement from miles away. Basically, they were evolution's way of saying nightmare fuel. Captain Thrak, if my translation software was working correctly, seemed to be giving orders to his crew. The universal translator crackled to life in my pod. "Remember, we need live specimens." Thrak's voice buzzed through the speakers. "The buyers pay extra for conscious prey. Try not to damage them too badly." Well, wasn't that just peachy? I should have called for backup right then. Should have contacted the Galactic Peacekeepers. Should have done a lot of things, actually. But honestly, what was I supposed to report? Hey, 6 moderately dangerous pirates are about to terrorize some primitive mammals. They'd probably send me a form to fill out in triplicate. Besides, I was curious. The Vrakari usually went after more challenging prey. What could they possibly want with humans? I got my answer about 20 minutes later. The hunting party moved through Pine Ridge with practiced efficiency. Most of the humans were asleep, completely unaware that death was literally creeping through their streets. The Vrakari split up, checking houses, probably looking for the easiest targets. And that's when Brutus made his move. Now, I should probably explain about Brutus. He was one of the local wildlife specimens I'd been monitoring. Classification, honey badger, or as the humans called them, nature's middle finger to everything else. Small, stocky, and possessing an attitude that made angry Vrakari look cuddly by comparison. Brutus lived with a family called the Millers. Tom Miller worked at the local hardware store. His wife, Lisa, taught at the elementary school. And their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had somehow convinced her parents that keeping a honey badger as a pet was a reasonable life choice. Humans, I swear. The Vrakari had identified the Miller house as a target. Probably looked easy enough. Single-story dwelling, minimal security, small family. What could go wrong? Thrak and 2 of his warriors approached the front door while the others took positions around the perimeter. Standard kidnapping protocol. They'd break in, grab whoever they could carry, and be gone before anyone knew what happened. Simple, efficient, and it had worked on dozens of worlds before. But they hadn't counted on Brutus. I watched through my sensors as Thrak placed a plasma cutter against the front door. The device hummed quietly as it began slicing through the lock mechanism. Inside, the family was sleeping peacefully. Well, except for Emma, who was having one of those childhood nightmares about monsters under the bed. Poor kid had no idea that real monsters were currently breaking into her house. The door swung open silently. Thrak gestured to his companions, and they began moving through the house with deadly precision. Tom and Lisa never even stirred as the warriors passed their bedroom. Military-grade sedatives in the air supply, no doubt. These guys were professionals. They found Emma's room without any trouble. The little girl was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes and looking confused. She probably heard something but couldn't quite figure out what had woken her up. Thrak stepped into the room, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction. "Perfect," he whispered. "Young ones always fetch the highest prices." Emma saw him and opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Terror had frozen her vocal cords. She pressed herself against the headboard, eyes wide with the kind of primal fear that every species in the galaxy understood. That's when Brutus decided he'd seen enough. The honey badger had been sleeping in his custom-built enclosure in Emma's room. One moment, everything was quiet. The next moment, there was a sound like a furious blender full of broken glass and bad intentions. The enclosure door, which should have been securely latched, exploded, outward in a shower of splinters and bent metal. "What in the seven hells?" Thrak started to say, just before 30 pounds of pure rage and bad attitude launched itself directly at his face. Now, I'd studied honey badgers in my xenobiology courses, but reading about them and watching one in action are two completely different experiences. Brutus moved like liquid violence, claws extended, teeth bared, making sounds that would have made a Vrakari war chant seem like a lullaby. He hit Thrak's center mass, claws finding gaps in the chitinous armor with surgical precision. The Vrakari captain let out a sound somewhere between a roar and a shriek as Brutus began what I can only describe as the most thorough dismantling I'd ever witnessed. "Get it off me!" Thrak screamed, trying to grab the honey badger with his multiple arms. "Get it off!" But Brutus was having none of it. He bit down on one of Thrak's secondary arms and began twisting with the kind of determination usually reserved for opening particularly stubborn jars. There was a wet snapping sound, followed by even more screaming. The other two Vrakari in the room tried to help their captain, but that turned out to be a tactical error. Brutus was operating on pure protective instinct now, and anything that moved was a threat to Emma. He released Thrak's mangled arm and launched himself at the nearest warrior. "By the void!" the warrior gasped, raising his plasma rifle. "What kind of creature is this?" He never got to fire. Brutus latched onto the weapon and began gnawing through the barrel with teeth that could crack bones. The rifle sparked, smoked, and then exploded in a shower of components and alien profanity. Meanwhile, Thrak was stumbling around the room, green blood streaming from multiple wounds, trying to stop the bleeding from where his arm used to be. "Retreat!" he shouted to his remaining companion. "Fall back to the ship!" But the third Vrakari was having problems of his own. Brutus had apparently decided that since he was already committed to this fight, he might as well make it memorable. The honey badger was now clinging to the warrior's back, methodically working his way through the armor plating like it was made of tissue paper. Emma, meanwhile, had found her voice. "Go, Brutus!" she shouted, clapping her hands together. "Get the bad aliens!" I couldn't help but laugh. Only a human child would treat a life-or-death battle like a sporting event. Though, to be fair, Brutus was definitely winning. The commotion had finally woken Tom and Lisa Miller. I watched through my sensors as they stumbled into Emma's room, took one look at the carnage, and immediately went into full parental protection mode. "Emma, get behind us!" Tom shouted, grabbing a baseball bat from the closet. Lisa was already on her phone, dialing emergency services. "What the hell are those things?" Lisa screamed, pointing at the blood-covered Vrakari who were trying to limp toward the window. "I don't know," Tom replied, raising the bat. "But they picked the wrong house to mess with." That's when things got really interesting. The other three Vrakari had heard the commotion and were converging on the Miller house. I watched them burst through the front door, weapons drawn, expecting to find their companions securing prisoners. Instead, they found a war zone. Thrak was attempting to crawl toward the window, leaving a trail of green blood and what I assumed were Vrakari curse words. His second-in-command was unconscious on the floor, his armor shredded beyond recognition. The third warrior was pinned against the wall by Brutus, who was apparently trying to see how many holes he could bite in chitinous plating before getting bored. And standing in the middle of it all were Tom and Lisa Miller, armed with a baseball bat and a table lamp respectively, looking like they were prepared to take on the entire Vrakari war fleet if necessary. "Oh, come on," one of the newcomers muttered. "How hard can it be to subdue a few primitives?" Famous last words, as it turned out. The lead warrior raised his plasma rifle and took aim at Tom Miller. That's when Brutus decided the current Vrakari wasn't entertaining enough anymore and switched targets. The honey badger launched himself across the room with a sound like a chainsaw having an argument with a garbage disposal. The warrior never saw him coming. One moment he was lining up a shot. The next moment he was on the ground screaming while Brutus introduced him to the fine art of aggressive dental work. Tom Miller, not to be outdone, stepped forward and brought his baseball bat down on the warrior's weapon. There was a satisfying crack as both the rifle and probably several Vrakari bones broke simultaneously. "That's for trying to hurt my family," Tom shouted, winding up for another swing. The remaining two Vrakari looked at each other, then at the chaos surrounding them, then back at each other. I could practically see the gears turning in their compound eyes. "Retreat," one of them said quietly. "Retreat," the other agreed. They turned and ran. But Brutus wasn't finished. The honey badger had worked himself into what biologists call a rage state, which is basically the animal kingdom's equivalent of berserker mode. He released his current victim and began pursuing the fleeing Vrakari through the house, making sounds that would have given adult nightmares to most galactic species. I watched through my scanners as the chase moved through the Miller's living room, kitchen, and eventually out into the backyard. The Vrakari were running at full speed, which for their species was considerable. But Brutus was keeping pace, occasionally leaping onto one of them for a quick reminder that this was his territory. The chase continued through Pine Ridge's main street, past the general store, around the church, and through Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rose garden. By now, the entire town was awake and watching from their windows as 6 alien invaders fled in panic from what appeared to be a small, extremely angry mammal. Sheriff Murphy was standing in the middle of the street in his pajamas, holding his service pistol and trying to process what he was seeing. "What in the Sam Hill?" he muttered, just as the pack of Vrakari sprinted past him, followed closely by Brutus, who was apparently having the time of his life. The chase ended at the edge of town where the Vrakari ship was hidden. The surviving warriors scrambled up the boarding ramp, nursing their wounds and probably reconsidering their career choices. Thrak, who had somehow managed to keep up despite his injuries, was the last one aboard. "Emergency takeoff!" he screamed to the ship's pilot. "Now! Now! Now!" The ship's engines roared to life, and the vessel began lifting off. But Brutus apparently wasn't ready for the party to end. The honey badger made one final leap, his claws scraping against the ship's hull as it rose beyond his reach. He landed on the ground, looked up at the departing vessel, and let out what I can only describe as the most threatening victory roar I'd ever heard from a 30-pound mammal. The Vrakari ship disappeared into the night sky, presumably to find easier prey somewhere else in the galaxy. Preferably somewhere that didn't have honey badgers. Brutus trotted back to town like he'd just finished his evening constitutional, completely ignoring the fact that he'd single-handedly repelled an alien invasion. He found Emma waiting for him on the front porch, wrapped in a blanket and grinning from ear to ear. "Good boy, Brutus," she said, scratching behind his ears. "You showed those mean aliens who's boss." The honey badger made a satisfied chirping sound and curled up next to her, apparently ready for a well-deserved nap. I sat in my observation pod, staring at my scanner readings and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. According to my instruments, 6 fully armed Vrakari warriors, each capable of taking on a squad of galactic peacekeepers, had just been defeated by a single Earth mammal weighing less than most of their weapons. My report to the Galactic Council was going to be interesting, but that was tomorrow's problem. Right now, I was too busy laughing to worry about paperwork. Somewhere out there, Captain Thrak was probably trying to explain to his superiors how his elite hunting party had been destroyed by what humans called a pet. I made a mental note to recommend an immediate revision to Earth's classification status. Harmless herbivores with mild intelligence was clearly no longer accurate. Any planet that produced creatures like honey badgers and humans crazy enough to keep them as pets deserved a much higher threat rating. Much higher. As I settled back in my chair to continue my observations, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Vrakari had friends, and news of their humiliating defeat would spread through the galactic underworld eventually. Other predators would want to test themselves against Earth's defenses. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. After all, if a honey badger could do this much damage, what would happen when the humans really got angry? I was about to find out sooner than I expected. 3 days later, my peaceful monitoring duty turned into the biggest diplomatic incident in galactic history. And it all started with a single transmission that made my translator circuit smoke from the sheer volume of profanity. "This is Admiral Korrath of the Vrakari battle fleet." The message crackled through my communications array. "We demand immediate satisfaction for the unprovoked attack on our reconnaissance vessel." I nearly choked on my breakfast. Unprovoked. These morons had tried to kidnap a child and were now calling it reconnaissance. The audacity was almost impressive, but things got worse. Much worse. Within hours, my long-range sensors detected not 1, not 2, but 7 Vrakari warships dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system. Each one was roughly the size of a small moon and packed with enough firepower to glass an entire continent. "Oh, perfect," I muttered, frantically typing commands into my communication console. This is exactly what my performance review needed. A full-scale invasion because of a honey badger. I tried contacting Galactic Command, but apparently they were in session debating trade regulations or some equally thrilling bureaucratic nonsense. My emergency beacon got routed to an automated response system that cheerfully informed me my call was important and I should please hold for the next available representative. Meanwhile, Admiral Korrath was broadcasting demands to the entire planet. His transmission was being picked up by every radio telescope and satellite dish on Earth, though thankfully the humans couldn't understand a word of it. "Primitive inhabitants of Sol 3, Korrath's voice boomed across the airwaves. "You have harbored a weapon of mass destruction disguised as a common animal. We demand you surrender this creature immediately, along with compensation for our injured warriors." I couldn't help myself. I actually laughed out loud. Here was one of the most feared military commanders in the galaxy, demanding Earth surrender a honey badger. If this wasn't career suicide, it was at least career manslaughter. But the humans weren't taking it lying down. Within 6 hours of the fleet's arrival, every major government on Earth had gone into emergency session. The United Nations called an unprecedented joint meeting. Military bases worldwide went to high alert. Scientists scrambled to make sense of the alien transmissions, and in Pine Ridge, Emma Miller was giving interviews to every news crew within a 100-mile radius. "Brutus isn't a weapon," she told a reporter from CNN, holding the honey badger in her lap like he was a particularly grumpy house cat. "He's just protective. Those mean aliens tried to hurt me, so he stopped them." Brutus, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by his newfound celebrity status. He was more interested in the chocolate chip cookie Emma was sharing with him, occasionally looking up at the cameras with the kind of expression that suggested he'd be happy to demonstrate his protection techniques on anyone who got too close to his human. That evening, things escalated. Admiral Korrath apparently decided that diplomatic solutions were for species with functioning brain cells. His fleet moved into Earth orbit, weapons powered and shields raised. The display was meant to be intimidating, and honestly, it probably would have been if not for what happened next. The humans called his bluff. President Martinez appeared on every television network, radio station, and internet stream simultaneously. She looked directly into the camera with the kind of expression usually reserved for dealing with particularly obnoxious door-to-door salesmen. "To the alien fleet currently threatening our planet," she began, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made my species' diplomatic training seem quaint. "Let me make something perfectly clear. You came to our world uninvited. You attempted to harm our children. And now you're demanding we hand over a family pet because your soldiers couldn't handle a 30-pound mammal." She paused, letting that sink in. "Here's our counteroffer. Leave. Now, before we show you exactly why that 30-pound mammal was just the warm-up act." I had to admit, the woman had style. But I also had access to the Vrakari military database, and I knew exactly how many ways 7 warships could sterilize a planet. This was either the bravest or most foolish thing I'd ever witnessed. Admiral Korrath's response came within minutes. "You dare threaten the Vrakari Empire? We have weapons that can crack your pathetic planet like an egg. Surrender the creature, or we will take it from your cold, dead hands." That's when humanity showed its true colors. Within 12 hours, something remarkable happened. Every single human military installation, research facility, and manufacturing center shifted into overdrive. Satellite networks realigned. Deep space monitoring stations came online. Weapons that existed only in theoretical physics textbooks suddenly became very real and very operational. But the most impressive part wasn't the technology. It was the unity. Every nation on Earth, many of which had been at each other's throats for generations, suddenly found themselves working together with a kind of efficiency that would have made a hive mind jealous. Language barriers dissolved. Political differences evaporated. Ancient grudges got shelved indefinitely. All because someone had threatened their children and their pets. I watched through my sensors as massive construction projects began appearing seemingly overnight. Orbital defense platforms that shouldn't have existed for another century. Energy weapons that violated at least 6 laws of physics. And in the middle of it all, a steady stream of supply ships heading toward previously unknown military installations. Where the hell did all this come from? I wondered aloud, running continuous scans that kept finding new installations. The answer came from an encrypted human transmission I managed to intercept. Apparently, humanity had been preparing for this exact scenario for decades, just in case someone decided their planet looked like a nice place to invade. They called it Project Guardian, and it was the most paranoid, over-engineered, and absolutely brilliant defensive network I'd ever encountered. But Admiral Korrath wasn't impressed. On the 4th day, he decided to make an example of Pine Ridge. "We will demonstrate the futility of your resistance," he announced. "The settlement that harbors the creature will be eliminated. Consider it a lesson in consequences." One of his destroyers broke formation and began descending toward Earth's atmosphere. Energy readings spiked as the ship powered its main weapons array. This was it. The humans had 12 minutes before Pine Ridge became a smoking crater. That's when Project Guardian went live. The first indication something was wrong came when the destroyer's shield started fluctuating. Then its engines began stuttering. Then its weapon systems went offline entirely. "What's happening to my ship?" Korrath demanded over the communications channel. The answer came from an unlikely source. Emma Miller's voice, broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. "You picked the wrong planet, Mr. Alien," her 8-year-old voice carried across space with crystal clarity. "Nobody messes with our families." What followed was the most one-sided space battle in galactic history. Hidden installations across Earth opened fire simultaneously. Weapons that had been disguised as radio telescopes, research stations, and weather monitoring equipment revealed their true purpose. Energy beams lanced up from the surface, each one precisely targeted and devastatingly effective. The descending destroyer lasted exactly 43 seconds before its hull began buckling under the combined assault. Warning lights flashed across its bridge as system after system failed catastrophically. "Impossible," Korrath screamed. "These primitives don't have this technology." But humanity was just getting started. The real surprise came when the rest of the Vrakari fleet tried to return fire. Their targeting systems couldn't lock onto the Earth-based weapons. Every time they thought they'd found a target, it disappeared or turned out to be a decoy. The humans had somehow managed to make their entire planet effectively invisible to Vrakari sensors. Meanwhile, the destroyer was experiencing what could only be described as a comprehensive military education. Every weapon system humanity had ever developed, from kinetic impactors to directed energy weapons to things that probably shouldn't have existed outside of science fiction novels, was demonstrating its effectiveness on Vrakari technology. The ship's hull breached in 17 places before its captain finally managed to scream a surrender. Admiral Korrath watched his supposedly unstoppable destroyer get systematically dismantled by a species he'd classified as primitive herbivores, and made what was probably the smartest decision of his military career. "Fall back," he ordered his remaining ships. "Full retreat." But humanity wasn't finished teaching lessons. As the Vrakari fleet turned to flee, every single defense installation on Earth powered down simultaneously. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any weapon could have been. Then President Martinez's voice filled the void. "Admiral Korrath," she said, her tone conversational. "You seem to be leaving. That's probably wise. But before you go, let me explain something about humans and our pets." The transmission was being broadcast on every frequency, ensuring that not just the Vrakari fleet, but every monitoring station in the sector could hear it clearly. "You see, we don't just keep animals as companions. We consider them family. And when someone threatens our family, we don't just defend them. We make sure the threat never comes back." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Your ship's computers now contain detailed scans of every Vrakari vessel in your fleet. Your shield frequencies, weapon signatures, engine configurations, even the molecular composition of your hull plating. This information has been transmitted to every human military installation, research facility, and deep space monitoring station." Admiral Korrath's compound eyes probably went wide at that revelation, though it was hard to tell from my position. "Furthermore," Martinez continued, "we've taken the liberty of placing tracking devices on each of your ships, undetectable, self-replicating, and impossible to remove without completely rebuilding your vessels from scratch. We'll know where you are, where you're going, and what you're planning for the foreseeable future." The silence from the Vrakari fleet was deafening. "Now, here's what's going to happen." The president's voice carried the kind of authority usually reserved for natural disasters and divine proclamations. "You're going to leave our solar system. You're going to spread the word throughout your little pirate network that Earth is off limits. And you're never, ever going to threaten our children again." She leaned closer to the camera, and her next words carried a smile that would have given nightmares to apex predators across the galaxy. "Because if you do, we won't send a honey badger next time. We'll handle it ourselves. And trust me, Admiral, you really don't want to find out what angry humans are capable of." The Vrakari fleet departed the solar system at maximum velocity, leaving behind only sensor ghosts and probably several therapy bills. I sat in my observation pod, staring at readings that still didn't make complete sense. According to my instruments, humanity had just demonstrated technology centuries ahead of their supposed development level, unified their entire species in less than a week, and successfully intimidated one of the galaxy's most aggressive military forces. All to protect a honey badger named Brutus. My report to the Galactic Council was going to rewrite every first contact protocol in existence. But first, I had a call to make. The emergency line to Galactic Command finally connected, and Director Xyloth's face appeared on my screen, looking appropriately bureaucratic and mildly annoyed. "Agent Velox," she began, "I trust your routine monitoring assignment is proceeding without incident?" I looked at my sensor reading showing the rapidly retreating Vrakari fleet, the still glowing energy signatures from Earth's primitive weapons, and a honey badger currently being interviewed by what appeared to be every news organization on the planet. "Director," I said carefully, "I need to recommend an immediate reclassification for Sol 3. "Oh. What classification would you suggest?" I thought about Admiral Korrath's fleet fleeing at maximum speed from a 30-pound mammal and his human family. "Class Omega threat level," I replied, "with a notation that any aggressive action toward this species or their companion animals will result in immediate and comprehensive retaliation." Director Xyloth blinked her 6 eyes in surprise. "That's quite a significant upgrade from harmless herbivores, Agent Velox. What exactly happened down there?" I smiled, pulling up the footage of Brutus single-handedly dismantling 6 Vrakari warriors while Emma cheered him on. "Director," I said, "let me tell you about the day a honey badger rewrote galactic law." The story spread throughout the galaxy within weeks. Trading posts, military academies, diplomatic missions, everywhere that different species gathered, they told the tale of the small blue planet where the inhabitants kept apex predators as pets and considered them family. The Vrakari never recovered their reputation. Admiral Korrath was quietly reassigned to monitoring space weather patterns in an uninhabited sector. Captain Thrak entered therapy and eventually became a surprisingly successful grief counselor for other species who'd encountered Earth fauna. And in Pine Ridge, Emma Miller continued taking Brutus to school for show and tell, blissfully unaware that her pet had become the most famous animal in galactic history. The Galactic Council established the Brutus Protocols, a comprehensive set of guidelines for dealing with species that kept dangerous predators as companions. The first rule was simple: don't. As for me, I got promoted to senior xenobiologist and assigned to establish Earth's first official diplomatic mission. It was an honor, really, even if it meant spending the rest of my career trying to explain to various alien dignitaries why humans thought it was reasonable to share their homes with creatures that could kill them in their sleep. But honestly, after watching Brutus defend Emma Miller against impossible odds and seeing humanity unite to protect both of them, I was starting to understand. Family isn't about species or size or evolutionary compatibility. It's about who you'd fight the entire galaxy to protect. And apparently, humans would fight for anyone they called family, no matter how small, furry, or ridiculously dangerous they happened to be. The galaxy was still figuring out what to do with that information, but one thing was certain: nobody was ever going to mess with Earth's pets again.